Again, my name is Jennifer Hamann, and I am a registered nurse. I have a master's in healthcare administration in addition to my nursing degrees. I'm here, John and Julie gave you some really excellent information. I'm here to help make some of that information real, bring it down to earth. Over my lifetime, I have seen this steady devaluing of human life. It's frightening in its scope, really frightening. We saw the first really anti-life legislation that came out there, and it wasn't, I'm sorry, not legislation, but laws via the Supreme Court had to do with life at the beginning of life. And we saw our infants in the womb, our children before they're born, in danger. And why should we be surprised that if we don't value these new humans that have so much potential ahead of them, why should we be surprised that we're not going to value people at the end of their lives also? And before too long, we're going to find reasons to not value people in the middle of their lives or in the peak of their lives. We have seen in recent history, and by recent, I'm not talking the last 10 years, obviously, but we saw the eugenics under Hitler, okay? Margaret Sanger, by the way, was one of his advisors. She helped him develop his eugenics program to start killing off anybody that was not of value under the German regime, under the Nazi regime. So we embraced her here in our country in a different way. A little bit I want to tell you about the diagnosis of brain death. All right. There is a Uniform Determination of Death Act that states that an individual is dead when he or she has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. Okay. Even with that, there's really no consistent criteria for diagnosing brain death. And if there's no consistent criteria, it's as good as having no criteria. Unless we have consistent criteria, we don't have criteria at all. As a nurse, we have criteria for determining whether or not blood pressures are within normal limits or not. If we didn't have consistent criteria, then, I might say 160 over 95 is normal, but it's not. Okay, so we need consistent criteria to actually have some valid diagnosis of any kind. Now, there's clinical information. There's a big book that medical people use to create a numeric value to different diagnoses. It's called, we had the ICD-9 and it's recently upgraded to the ICD-10. This is a book that insurance companies require that healthcare professionals use these numeric numbers for the diagnostic criteria in order to get reimbursed by insurance. The ICD-10 states, a state of prolonged irreversible cessation of all brain activity, including lower brainstem function, with the complete absence of voluntary movements, responses to stimuli, brainstem reflexes, and spontaneous respirations. That's their diagnosis, their criteria for diagnosing brain death. Notice it doesn't provide criteria to define what it means by prolonged, okay? Prolonged could be days, could be weeks, could be months. What is prolonged, okay? Could be hours, all right? Are you aware that a person cannot even take one single breath on their own without lower brain function? if a person is breathing on their own, even taking an occasional breath on their own, they cannot be brain dead, even according to these diagnostic criteria. However, people are frequently diagnosed as brain dead, even though they're able to take spontaneous breaths. They cannot possibly be brain dead if they're even able to take a single breath. Also, the heart only works normally without brain function for a short time. If the brain is not functioning in any way, the heart may continue to beat for up to 1 week. 1 week. But usually ceases within 72 hours. That's 3 days. So when we hear stories about how this person is brain dead, they've been on life support for months. They can't be brain dead, because if they were truly brain dead, their hearts would have stopped functioning. They would have had no heartbeat after 1 week. So they cannot possibly be brain dead according to the criteria that is laid out here. So all of these diagnoses of brain death for patients who have been in a comatose condition for months are lies. It's all lies. Now for my story. I grew up, I was born in 59, and I grew up with these little spells that would occur. We didn't know what they were. I just would my parents said I would be off in my own little world. You know, there's Jenny off in her own little world again. She'll join us in a few minutes. You know, and I would lose bits of time. And I remember an occasion in the school playground when I lost this bit of time, and all of a sudden I became aware again of what's going on around me. And there were children standing around pointing at me and laughing. And I thought, what's funny? What are they laughing at? And I realized I had wet myself, and there was a puddle on the playground under my feet. Well, I learned to compensate for these little periods of missed time by becoming a really excellent note taker. Even at a very early age, I relied on my notes to keep track of what did I miss, what did I lose, because I would have one of these spells and I would lose a chunk of time, not just the instance that I was in that spell, but I would lose maybe the last hour. And so I had to compensate for that with really good note-taking. By grade 3, I was probably taking better notes than most high school students, and by grade 5, I was probably taking better notes than most college students. In my young adulthood, I went through the usual thing. I went to college, I got married, I had children, and I wanted to be home with my children. When they were little, I decided that I would stay home with them until they're in elementary school. So I did daycare in order to have some kind of income while I was staying home with my children. And I had my 2 children, plus I had 10 more children. I had 12 kids altogether in my daycare. One of the children, I'll get to that in a minute, hang on. But I wanted to let you know, in 1984, these spells that I'd had them all my life, and I really didn't think anything of them, started to escalate and get worse. They would leave me more debilitated for a period of time. They would leave me more disoriented. I sometimes even had numbness on one side of my body. I had a grandfather who had had a stroke at age 50, and I thought, I wonder if I'm having mini strokes. You know, they call them TIAs, for transient ischemic attacks. And I thought, I wonder if that's what's happening. So I kept, it was never a really big issue, and I just kept not attending to it. You know, as we often do with things that we just are normal to us, we don't deal with it. Well, one day I was sewing at my machine, and I had one of these spells. And when I came out of the spell, I looked down at my fabric and everything, and there was blood on the material. And I thought, what in the world? My first thought is maybe I had a nosebleed. So I was going to reach up and touch my nose, and I couldn't move my hand because I had sewn through my finger, and I had like 3 stitches going through my finger. And I remember clipping the thread on either side and looking up and thinking, I should get those threads out before the feeling comes back, because I'll bet that's going to hurt. My next thought was my first rational thought. This is not normal. I need to see a doctor. So I did. I went to see a doctor, and he ran a battery of tests. He did an MRI, EEG. EEG stands for electroencephalogram. That's where they measure the brain waves, okay? Did a whole bunch of different tests, and then called me in for the follow-up. And during the follow-up visit, he says, well, I have some good news and some bad news and some good news. And I said, okay, give it to me. He said, the good news is you're not having a stroke. These aren't mini strokes. I said, okay, now for the bad news. The bad news is you have epilepsy. These are seizures. And I said, well, I thought seizures were people fall down and flop around. And he said, no, there's different kinds of seizures, and these are seizures. And he says, and it's not unusual that you've had these. Most people outgrow them by the time they're in their 20s. They've outgrown these seizures. But in your case, you didn't outgrow them, and so they've evolved into something a little more. And I said, and you said there was another good news? He says, yes, we can treat it. We have medication we can give you that will get the seizures under control, and it should be fine. So I said, great. So he started me on 2 medications called Dilantin and phenobarbital. These are anti-seizure or seizure control drugs. And after a few weeks on these medications, I remember waking up one morning and thinking, something's different. Something feels strange. I don't know, but I had a whole bunch of kids coming, and I had my own kids to take care of, and I didn't have time to really deal with it. So move on like I always did, you know? And after I got the kids fed, and they were all sitting down watching, I don't know, Sesame Street or something, and I'm washing dishes, and it suddenly occurred to me, wait a minute, it's not something wrong. It's something right. My head does not hurt. You see, there's something that happens after a person has a seizure. There's a variety of things that can happen, but one major thing that's pretty consistent with epilepsy is that the person will have a pretty nasty headache after the seizure. And I was 24, almost 25 years old. And for the first time in my life that I could recall, my head did not hurt. I had had seizures so frequently for my entire life that I had a constant headache. That was my norm. And here I was, almost 25, and it was like, oh, my head doesn't hurt. Hey, I could get used to this. Kind of nice. Okay. So life was good. Life went on. I continued to take care of my children, daycare children. I was seizure-free for the first time in my life. I was headache-free. I felt good. Okay. Then it was less than a year later. It was the spring of 1985. One of the daycare kids' parents were in the reserves, and they had taken a trip to Central America, and they had their little one with them when they went, and came back, and he had diarrhea. And I tried everything. I mean, I wasn't a nurse at that time, but I knew about hand washing and trying to prevent the spread of germs and all that. So I did everything to try to prevent it, but somehow this little guy passed it on to me, and I ended up with diarrhea. We went to the doctor and told him, and he ran a test, and he got a stool culture for me. And a few days later, I got a call from the clinic, and they said, we got the results back, and you have giardia, okay, which is a common traveler's diarrhea type thing. And I said, okay, so what do we do? And they said, this was an on-call physician, not my regular physician. And he said, well, there's a simple solution. We give you some medication and it clears it up. It treats it. And I said, well, whatever you order for me, doctor, has to be okay with my diagnosis. I have epilepsy, and I'm on these 2 medications for it. So whatever you get for me has to jive with all that and not be a problem. He said, no problem. It's Flagyl. It's very benign. It'll take care of the diarrhea and no problem. Well, I took my first dose, and I had my first ever grand mal seizure. I came to on the kitchen floor with all the kids around me crying. And I asked some of the older ones who were like 3 and 4 years old, what happened? They said, you just fell down and started flopping around, and we couldn't wake you up. Well, I called the clinic, and I told them what happened, and I said, should I stop this medication? And they said, hold on, and they put me on hold, came back and said, doctor says do not stop the medication. He said, you need it to get the diarrhea under control. The reason they think that you had the grand mal seizure is because you've had such bad diarrhea that your regular seizure medications are being flushed out of your system too fast, and you're not, so you're having withdrawal seizures. I said, okay, you guys are the experts. So that evening, I took my second dose, and I had my second grand mal seizure, and then a third, and then a fourth. And exhausted, my husband helped me to bed, called the people on my contact list and told them I would not be available to babysit the next day, and arranged for a neighbor to come over and spend the day with us. In the morning, he tried to wake me to let me know he was leaving, but that Susan would be on her way and she should be there in a few minutes. I couldn't respond. I could hear him, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was open my eyes, and he knew something was really seriously wrong. So he called 911. An ambulance arrived, took me to the hospital. I continued to seize. They put an EEG on me, and they said, she's in a perpetual seizure. She's in a seizure, and we can't stop it. And they tried all kinds of things. They loaded me up with neurosuppressants. That means drugs that decrease brainwave activity, okay? But before they could stop the seizures, I coded. That means I went into cardiopulmonary arrest. My heart stopped, my breathing stopped. And they came in, and they worked to revive me. I remember that code. I had an out-of-body experience during that code, and I could see everything that was happening. It was like I was hovering in the air above myself. And it was like I kept pulling further and further away, like there was no ceiling to obstruct the view. Just I was getting further away. And the next thing I know, I was in a whole different place. And it was a warm and comforting place, a place of light. The light was in me. I was in the light. And the light was Jesus. Now, some people have a problem with that. I understand. But that's what happened. And I said, Lord, if you want me, I'm ready. And he said, I have much more for you to do. And then, boom, I was back. I felt the shock. It was like, oh, that hurt. I was back. I had a second code. I have no memory of the second code. God had already accomplished his purpose to let me know that he had a purpose for me. So I was in a coma when they finally got the seizures stopping. I found out later that they estimate the seizures had been continuous for about 10 hours. Now, I want you to stop and think for a moment. When a person has a 1-minute epileptic seizure, They have about 4 hours of time that they need to fully recover from that. Okay? 4 hours. I had 10 hours. So somebody do the math. 60 minutes in an hour, 600 minutes, multiply that by 4 hours. Anybody got it? About 1,000 days. So about 3 years. About 3 years to recover, right? Well, it was less than a week later, the doctors declared me brain dead because of suppressed brainwave activity. They tried to convince my husband that I was brain dead. There was no chance of recovery. They told him he'd be burdened with a vegetable for the rest of his life if he didn't let them just end my life, and that so many people could benefit from my organs. I'm a young, healthy specimen, and think of all the people that could benefit. Rather than letting your wife gradually deteriorate and rot over time, let's let all these people benefit. She's dead anyway. Now, here's something I didn't tell you. While I was in the coma, I could hear and I could understand. I could hear the doctors talking and trying to convince my husband that I was not really there and that he should just sign this paperwork to let them have my organs. And I thank God to this day for my husband saying, no, our family needs her. We've got to give her a fighting chance. I didn't know it then, but I know it now since things went on, and later on I became a nurse, right? But I know that the drugs they gave me to stop the seizures, and they still had me on those drugs afterwards, would have artificially induced a coma. And the doctors knew that. They had to know that. For a long time, I decided to give the doctors the benefit of the doubt. They just didn't know any better. Now I realize they knew. They knew. They just also knew that they could profit from my organs. Okay? All right, so while in the coma, and I could hear and understand, I had awake and asleep times. And when I was asleep, I was like any person who's asleep. I didn't know what was going on around me. But when I was awake, I could hear and understand. I just couldn't respond. There was a nurse, she became my favorite nurse. I could hear different footsteps, and I came to recognize from their steps which nurse it would be. And this nurse came in, and she would talk to me while she was working with me. She'd let me know what she's doing. I'm just cleaning you up, going to reposition you a little bit here, or I'm here to hang up some new food for you. I was tube fed. I'm here to clean the vent, to make sure you don't have too much mucus. And so she talked to me, and I really liked that nurse. Then there were some nurses who weren't so good. These nurses came in, and they never spoke to me. They spoke over me. And I remember one nurse in particular, I had never heard her voice. I recognized her footfalls. I knew that this nurse was coming in, and I was like, oh, yeah, great. And she comes in, and I heard her voice for the very first time. She said, would somebody come in here and help me turn this thing? Yeah, this thing. She called me a thing. It's like, what? No matter what happens, a person is a person. They are never a thing, okay? A doctor, I heard one time a bunch of footsteps come into the room, and I don't know how many there were. And I heard multiple sets of feet, and I could tell there were quite a few people there. And this one very authoritative sounding voice says, Now, this one is a sad case. Young woman, 2 small children at home. She's really essentially brain dead. She only has about a 1% chance of ever coming out of this coma, and if she does, she'll just be a vegetable. Okay. Another voice spoke up and said, "Doctor, is it really appropriate to speak like this in front of the patient?" And the doctor said, "Hello, I told you she's brain dead. There's nothing there." And I'm like, I am not brain dead. You know, I remember being extubated and how hard it was. See, what happens when a person has a tube is their body literally forgets how to breathe. They have this ventilator that is breathing for them, okay? And maybe when they first get the ventilator, maybe they really need it. But once a sufficient amount of healing takes place, many people on a ventilator can be extubated and they can eventually breathe on their own. But you have to do something. There's a process that we have to go through. We have to wean them off the ventilator because they have literally forgotten how to breathe. Well, they didn't try to wean me off. I think it was an effort to convince my husband that I really was brain dead. And they were prepared to start the ventilator up again so that they could keep me viable to get my organs. But when they extubated me, my favorite nurse was there. And she said, "Come on, breathe. Just take a breath. You can do it. Come on, breathe." I tried. Nothing happened. She says, "Come on, you can breathe." Oh, those first breaths hurt. But I was breathing on my own. They did not re-intubate me. And I breathed on my own. Proof I was not brain dead. I was still unresponsive as far as being able to tell someone anything or speak or communicate in any way. But finally one day when my favorite nurse came in, the desire to just see her, to see what she looked like was so powerful that I opened my eyes. And I could see her, and she was beautiful to me. I think she would have been beautiful to me if she had been the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I don't know, but she was beautiful. And she saw my eyes open, and it was like, "Well, hello there. Welcome back." And she says, "Can you speak?" Couldn't speak. It was no good. Nothing intelligible would come out of my mouth. She said, "That's okay. Don't worry. Can you blink your eyes?" I blinked my eyes. She says, "Okay, good." So then she said, "Okay, once for yes, twice for no." We started communicating. She asked me my name. She offered a variety of different names before coming to my real name, and I identified which name was mine. Anyway, a number, "Do you have children? You know, blink how many children you have." And I blinked for 2, and you know, so anyway, I communicated, and I was answering questions appropriately and correctly, which was proof that I understood and that I was cognitive, okay? So I was transferred after that to a regular bed in a regular unit. And I was in that regular bed for a few weeks and gradually started getting some of my function back. I remember the day I had feeling in my feet for the first time. The doctor came in every day with this little sharp thing, and he would run it up my foot. I never responded. I never felt it. And then all of a sudden, one day, he runs it up my foot, and my foot jumped. And the nurse got all excited. "Did you see that? Did you see that?" It's like, "Yes, nurse, I saw that." And so, oh, by the way, the doctor who declared me brain dead Once I regained consciousness, he never showed his face again. Never, no. So, but it took, all told, it was about 3 months before I was fully functional and able to, say, take myself to the bathroom and feed myself and really take care of myself. And it was probably a good year of recovery before I was really strong again. Anyway, I wanted to kind of talk with you about a few things. I have continued to live a very full life. Something very important I wanted to tell you. While I was in the coma, under a diagnosis of brain death, I made a major life decision. I decided to give up accounting and become a nurse. Okay? This brain-dead woman, I am the very first brain-dead woman to graduate from my master's program with honors. All right, I want you to think about a few things. Just consider these. Everything that all of us have told you today is just the tip of the iceberg. We're hoping that with everything we've told you today, what'll happen is you'll want more. You'll leave here wanting to know and understand more and to share the information with other people. We're really hoping this is just the beginning of your research into all of these topics. So please don't let this be the end of your learning about these different topics. Please take this information forward. So consider this. Can we really know what patients who cannot speak for themselves want? Can we know it? So if asked before this whole life-threatening thing had happened to me, if I would want to live dependent on machines, I had never really talked about it before that, but I probably would have said, no, I don't want to live like that. Okay? But faced with the reality, I had a very powerful desire to live. Very strong. If I had not had a husband who was willing to just stand firm, I wouldn't have been around to help raise our children. I would never have met my grandchildren. I would never have become a nurse. And as a nurse, I was involved in saving a lot of lives. There were times when I was the only one who could figure out what was happening. And a life was saved because of that. I became a teacher later on and started teaching the future nurses. And I instilled a respect and value of human life in those nurses. I let my students know. I would tell them my story. I would say, do not ever, ever assume that a patient cannot hear you. Many people do not hear while they're in a coma. But, they'll come out of the coma and they have no memory of it. But other people like myself, they do. We do remember. Another thing is there is no way to know when or if patients may be aware. So we must treat every patient with dignity and compassion. Okay? And also, could a diagnosis of persistent vegetative state, that's PVS is the abbreviation for that, could that be a death sentence for patients? And when someone is diagnosed, how does that alter the way we care for them? If they're diagnosed as somehow not having worth in a utilitarian way, in an increasingly utilitarian world, then we treat them differently if we don't think they have value. language is really important. A living will. A living will. It should be rephrased, a will to die. Okay? The POLST, physician's orders for life-sustaining treatment. It should be renamed physician's orders against life-sustaining treatment. There's nothing for life-sustaining treatments in there. And I know John at one point said that, you know, it's profoundly wrong to devalue humans. I would go a step further and say it is profoundly evil. Okay? It's not just wrong. It's not just a mistake. Okay? It's a deliberate action, and it has an agenda. Okay? So you've heard of ordinary care and extraordinary care. Under more recent rules and definitions of ordinary and extraordinary care, feeding somebody has become considered extraordinary. Providing nutrition and hydration is never extraordinary. It's always ordinary care, even if we have to administer the food and fluids with a medical assistance. That's ordinary care. When a patient is deprived of ordinary care, they do not die from their underlying diagnosis. They die from dehydration and starvation. So the death certificate on these patients should read dehydrated to death, starved to death, dehydrated to death. It's not that they died from a brain injury, okay? It's not the brain injury that killed them. So I think at this point I just have one more thing. I want to talk a little bit about organ donation and organ procurement. Before my incident, I had the little pink dot on my license that said I could be an organ donor. And I found that because I had that dot, the pressure was on big time for my husband to let them harvest me. Heavy duty pressure. Do you realize that the profit, the money that is generated from one person's death by organ donation is about $5.5 million. You have 2 kidneys, 2 lungs, 1 pancreas, 1 liver that can be divided up because the liver regenerates, the intestines, and the heart. And when they harvest, they're very specific about the order in which they harvest, because if they take the heart first, then the other organs will lack circulation, and they'll become non-viable very quickly. So they take all these other organs first before they take the heart and lungs. So it's very, it has become a really efficient process to harvest someone. Just think about the word harvest. You are not a crop.